So we're finally actually getting into the details of this thing. But I just felt like it was necessary that we cover some of the matters that we're seeing in Tarboro, some of the responses and reactions. But there's an obvious need. You have it going now, right? Okay. There's an obvious need for God's power in this town. And this is the one thing that I'm very thankful for about Tarboro. And I mean that with all due respect and love for Tarboro. Ability is just not going to cut it in Tarboro. It doesn't matter who would come through and try to impact this town. It's just not going to cut it. Activities, however good they may be, however important it is to reach out to young people. And I haven't forgotten them. We're actually doing something for them as somewhat of a start-off next Sunday night. But however important it is to evangelize, Tarboro must have the original first century Pentecostal power in order to see anything. And it needs to be that way everywhere, sure. But the thing is especially here in this place, if there's none of that power that God has made available to us, ain't nothing going to happen. It doesn't matter if these people are taught by the Torah or if they're taught something completely apart from the Torah. However close or however far from the law, if God's not at work, nobody's going to move. Nobody's going to move. And this is not to say that God will move at the behest of false teaching or anything. I'm not saying that. But if His presence is not manifested at all, it really doesn't matter what's in the town, what's being taught to these people. The only way that we'll see His manifested presence here in Tarboro is through effectual, fervent prayer. That's really the bottom line. Prayer that cares, and I've seen prayer that cares in this church. God specifically commanded us to ask Him for the power of the Holy Spirit. As a pastor of 14 years, you can learn a whole lot of things. But of all the things that I've learned as a pastor here in Tarboro, there is no lesson greater than the amount of gravity that prayer has on a town, or lack of prayer thereof. I've seen progress rise and decline based on the prayers that go up in this church. In this church. Everything that I've seen happen in Tarboro for the past 14 years can all be traced to this church. Every time I see God work, I've seen weather change amazingly. I have seen God move in the hearts of people. I have seen God do amazing things in town because this church was praying. And I'm sure that there are other churches that pray, but I am able to trace it back to this little church right here. I'm not trying to be prejudiced. I'm not trying to be a favoritist or anything like that. I'm just saying that based on the facts, based on the things that I see it all tracing back to this church. When this church is weak in faith, it seems that Tarboro begins to fall apart. But when we're strong in the faith, however much His presence might be ignored by the people in Tarboro, I've seen His presence in a great way, and not only in this church, but in this town. And I'm saying this to encourage you. It didn't matter who was a part of the prayer meetings. It didn't matter their character. I really believe God honored faith in every prayer meeting that we've ever had in this church. I've come to learn that some people who were a part of our prayer meetings prayed for selfish reasons. But God heard those prayers anyway. He just wants to see if a man or a woman's willing to believe Him or not. No matter what the circumstances may be. It is possible to believe God and have selfish intentions. It really is. I think God honors the faith. In fact, I want to just ask you, if there was one to be honored, who is likely to be honored most if one of two were in the midst of a prayer meeting? The man who has God's commandments perfectly organized in his mind, yet has not the faith that God can carry them through, or the man who has selfish intentions but believes that God is able to do what He's asking him for? I personally think it's the man who has selfish intentions and believes that God's able to do it. Now, Does that mean that God... No, the Bible says that you have not because ye ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lusts. I understand that. But God honors that prayer more than the man who has everything organized and doesn't believe God at all. As unorthodox as that sounds, I believe that God honors the latter more. But it's like the story that's before us. It really is the story that's in our text. We won't read the whole passage again. Instead, we'll travel through it. We'll start by looking at the contrasts of these men, and we'll also consider some of the comparisons as well through this thing. But the differences are seen in their social status, their posture, the prayers themselves, and of course God's opinion of each prayer at the very end, which we basically looked at a little bit before we right at the beginning of the message. But first, let's consider their position. Okay, so you go ahead and change the there we go. Our position. I actually have an outline today, but we're going to consider their position. That is their social status. If you were a Jew, it was a great honor for a Pharisee to be a guest in your home. It was a tremendous honor. Pharisees were very exclusive about who they spent their time with. You must have been doing something right if they came to your house. All right? And that really goes to show you how profound Jesus' statement was to the tax collector, Zacchaeus. Hey, Zacchaeus, come down. I'm coming to your house today. You know the song. Kids know the song, I think. I think y'all know this. Yeah, you know Zacchaeus was a wee little man. Yeah, but Jesus was coming to his house. I'm about to explain to you who a Pharisee really is. Or I'm not a Pharisee, a publican, who he really is. Just out of curiosity, does anybody know what a Pharisee means? What the word Pharisee means?
Puffed up?
I don't think so. No. The word Pharisee was a respectful word. So, all right, Bryce, what is it? No. That's who the other guy was, okay? All right, so that was a publican. All right, but here is what it means. My boys are going to love this. A Pharisee is a separatist. I thought you guys would get a big kick out of it. That's something only my boys are going to understand. But anyway, if a Pharisee came to your house, you are what the British would call the macaroni of society. Huh? That sounds a little funny, right? All right. If you're lower class, the British would call you a doodle. All right? And now you have a whole new view of what Yankee Doodle means. That's actually historic, and that was free. All right? But in short, if a Pharisee came to your house, you were one of the uppities. You were the macaroni of the group. All right? On the other hand, if you were a tax collector, you were the most universally despised person in Israel. People didn't like you. In fact, they hated you if you were a publican. All right, I think it's a Pharisee. A publican. Tax collectors were basically turncoats, and they were criminals. And while they made lots of money for themselves, they were morally and ethically bankrupt. They were easily manipulated by Romans, and they were enemies of everything that was holy. In fact, to say you were a publican would be the same thing as calling yourself a harlot or a drunkard. It would pretty much be saying the same thing. It's kind of like me coming up and saying, "Hi, my name's Michael and I'm a drunkard." If I was to say publican, it would mean the very same thing in the ears of somebody else who was listening. It is so very important that you see just how wicked these publicans were so that you can have a better appreciation of what you're witnessing in this story. But tax collectors had a reputation for not only being dishonest and cruel, but also morally debauched in every possible way imaginable. The publican, the tax collector. If you were going to be a tax collector for the Romans, you would purchase a franchise from them, and then you were required to pay the Romans a fixed amount each year based on your collections. Anything that you collected over that was yours to keep. All right? Now, for the Romans and the publicans, this was a great system, but not for everybody else. All right? Tax collectors accumulated their wealth by taking unfair advantage of their own people. They were considered wretched traitors to their religion and to their nation. and they were excluded from all religious activity and normal society relationships. They were considered the furthest creatures from God. They were absolutely miserable people. They really helped you to understand the word miser and how that word is attached to miserable. These people were miserable people. They made Ebenezer Scrooge look like a saint, publicans. And so let me remind you again that the publican, the tax collector, the one that I just explained to you who that was, he was the one that Jesus described as going home justified, while the Pharisee went home condemned. I'm trying to paint a picture for you so that you can see that when people looked at the Pharisee, they thought this is a decent man. And when Jesus justified the publican, they were absolutely blown back. What on earth is he talking about? Their reaction, all right? Jesus comes and practically turns the righteousness of these Pharisees inside out. And you know, this really does sound similar to some of the things that the scoundrels are doing in our society today. It really does. I can think of several scoundrels that are doing things that cause me to practically despise them. So to compare it to today, Jesus is justifying a corrupt politician crying out for mercy over an independent, ostentatious, and when I say that, I mean a showy, sin-hating Baptist preacher who lives a hidden, wicked lifestyle behind closed doors. And believe me, we're seeing a lot of preachers falling today. A lot. And sadly, many times the ones who were the hardest on sin, it would seem. So we looked at the contrast in position. Now let's consider the contrast in their posture. Okay, so this is the next one. What I'm about to say is not specifying how we're supposed to pray positionally. All right? And I do mean physically. Leonard Ravenhill said, I'm going to remind you again, he said, prayer is not a latitude, it's an attitude. Prayer is also a constant posture, and that's spiritually. But I want you to see the spiritual contrast, all right? Look with me at verse 11 in our text, all right? Look with me at verse 11 in our text. The Pharisee stood and prayed as okay, wait a minute. Yeah, okay, I thought I was on the wrong one. Yes, the Pharisee stood and prayed. Stood and prayed, all right? As I already said, there's nothing necessarily wrong with standing and praying. In fact, this was a normal practice when you were praying in the temple. Many times people would stand in the temple and pray with their hands outstretched like this. They'd have their hands held up. But it was the custom of a Pharisee to be, and I keep using this word ostentatious because it's basically a showy form of trying to impress people. All right? It was their custom to be that way about their prayers. It was pretend. It was showy. It wasn't real. They were very showy, and no doubt they were in a position that would cause them to stand out and to stand apart at the same time from everybody else. Jesus said in his Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 6 and verse 5, "And when thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites are, for they love to pray standing in the synagogues and in the corners of the streets, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say unto you, they have their reward." Often it was the custom of a Pharisee to get as close to the Holy of Holies as he possibly could. Because, in his own opinion, he felt that he belonged there more than anybody else. I mean literally. And you know what? A lot of people thought that it was right for him to do so. They looked at him respectfully. You think of the most respectful person that you can think of, that's how they viewed the Pharisees. All right? The very essence of his words would suggest this. He said, "God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are." All right, so you can see that he stood apart. He stood out. It also says that he prayed with himself, which is to say that he was praying by himself. You know, a lot of times we don't consider the full meaning of corporate prayer. You think about that word corporate, that means together. You might say, well, And I'm not going after anybody who doesn't feel led to pray out loud. I understand that does not bother me at all. So I want to make sure that you know I'm not trying to attack anybody who chooses to remain silent. All right, you don't have to pray at all. All right, that's not the point that I'm trying to make. But this whole idea of, well, that's not how I've done things in the past. You're completely missing the whole concept of what prayer is about. When you're agreeing, if two of you shall agree, that means that we're praying about one thing in particular. And some of us, if we're not careful, we kill the prayer meeting because we refuse to pray corporately. But rather, as if no one else is present, or better yet, as if somehow our prayer is going to teach everybody else a lesson. It really does happen in prayer meetings. As I already explained, this was the MO of the Pharisee, a separatist. Right? He separated himself apart from everybody else because in his eyes, everyone else was unclean. That's how he looked at everybody. Now the tax collector, on the other hand, he separated himself as well. All right, so here's the comparison. Notice there is a separation from him as well, but for a very different reason. He didn't do it conspicuously. He didn't do it for a show. Look with me at verse 13, all right? And the publican, standing afar off. You see how that's worded differently? All right? Stood afar off, all right? Basically, he's standing as far away from the Holy of Holies as he could possibly get. Not as close to the Holy of Holies as he could possibly get. Why? He didn't just think he knew that he was unworthy to be in the presence of God. Or in the presence of other worshipers, for that matter. The fact that this man was in the temple, these people already knew this can't possibly be a true story that Jesus is telling. A publican in the temple? It's unheard of. All right? But this guy comes in, and basically he comes in ashamed and stands as far away from everybody else that he possibly can. Just as you could see the motive of the Pharisee in what he said, we also see how the publican's self-opinion was reflected in his description. All right, look at verse 13 again. And the publican, standing afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven. If you use your imagination, you can almost see that this publican almost knew that God was never going to forgive him. But the fact that he's standing in the temple at this moment reveals that he believed it was possible. That maybe God would forgive him. That perhaps maybe God would forgive him after all, no matter what people said. He was fully aware that he had alienated God in the profession that he chose. And why shouldn't God? Why shouldn't God alienate him in return? He alienated God. But he's thinking, maybe God will show me mercy. In Israel, the posture of eyes down and hands over the chest was a sign of humility. That's what that was. Whenever you see somebody with their hands on their chest, head down, it was a sign of humility. Basically, it was saying, me, I'm guilty here, all right? But this man made his hands into fists and was pounding his own chest. It would almost seem that he did it with an attitude of regret for all the things that he had done. How could God ever forgive me? God, be merciful. I'm not worthy of forgiveness, but God, be merciful, please. You can see the grief in this man. And I'm just going to tell you the truth here. I think that the most wretched form of humanity that lives and breathes God's air today, and this is my opinion, would be George Soros. You can change it. Everybody know who that guy is, right? He's wretched. He's an evil man. But imagine if he came walking into this church. Head bent down. He's avoiding people. And we're all whispering, poor guy, he looks so much like George Soros. Because we couldn't possibly believe that George Soros would ever come into a church, let alone our church. But he sits at the very back, knowing that no one would ever welcome him here. Thousands of innocent people have died because of that man. Because of his scheming, and all throughout the message, everybody's listening, but you can hear this in the back. And you're not sure if the guy's laughing or not, and you look back and you see just tears just coming down his face. And you hear him saying, "Oh God, have mercy, have mercy." Of all the people that have died because of this man, of all the cruel things that have taken place because of this man's bribery, I'd be inclined to think, may God have mercy on you indeed, you wretched coagulation of human evil. That's what I would think of him. I don't know if you've read some of the stuff about him, but he is a wretched man. He's like a publican. I mean, this is the publican, folks. And yet, God would accept that over some of the hypocritical prayers that he's heard prayed in this church. That's something, isn't it? It's enough to make some of us walk out the door. I mean, really, it is. That's what the story we're looking at now did to the people that were listening. They were completely unaware of the true identity of the Pharisee. They had no idea. They had great respect for them. No respect for a publican. The fact that a publican was in the temple, in and of itself, was an absurd idea, as I said already. So now we looked at the contrast of their position or their social status, then their posture, and now the contrast of their prayer. All right, so you change it now. The contrast of their prayer. We'll get him off the screen. Thank goodness, right? Boy, wouldn't it be wonderful to see him come in and get saved, though? What a great day that would be. As wretched as he is, I just, if I saw that old miserable man come in and get saved, you just know God, he's able to save them to the uttermost. It says that in the Bible, doesn't it? He really is. But anyway, so now we're visiting verse 11 again. So let's look at that. All right, the Pharisee stood and prayed. And here's just so you see the difference. He stood while the publican stood afar off. So you see how he stood and the publican stood afar off. There's a big difference. All right. So let's keep reading. Verse 11. All right, the Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself. God. All right, we'll stop there for just a moment. This can have two possible meanings. Was he praying like Hannah? Was he praying inaudibly? That means silently to himself? I seriously doubt it. A public place, lots of people, sinners all around him, including this publican. All right? No, I don't think he was praying to himself silently. I don't think that's what it means. He needed to make sure everybody knew that he was not like other men. He needed to make sure they knew that. Do you congratulate yourself silently? I mean, really, I think the only time I've ever said, "Good job, Mike," to myself was when I messed something up. Good job, Mike. All right. Or when I blundered, you know. No, this guy was praying very audibly. I think he was praying very loud so that people could hear him. So what is the other meaning? I think that his God was the man that he looked at in the mirror every morning. That's who I think this Pharisee was. I think he literally prayed to himself. I think that's what this is saying. I think he prayed to his own version of God. I'm going to tell you something. Corporate prayer is not just being considerate for those around us, but also considerate of God's direction in a prayer meeting as well. And if I'm unwilling to go in God's direction, if he's moving and I'm refusing, if I'm insistent to change its direction, I'm not praying to the God everybody else is praying to. I got to stop here. I know I'm going a while, but here's what I want you to get out of this. All right, your position, your posture, your prayer. What's God's opinion of that? What does he think about your position? What does he think about your posture? What does he, not me, not us, nobody. It's only you and God. What does he think about these things? We're here because of him, right? Our motives, whether selfish or selfless, they go unseen. They're unseen. But an unseen God sees them very clearly. And just as much as George Soros is repudiated by many because of what we know about him, many times our prayers are repudiated by God because of what he knows about us. And we really need to keep that in mind. We need to be aware, and we need to understand that the difference between a town that's going to listen to Jesus Christ wooing them to himself and a town that rejects him is a praying church or a non-praying church. And you know, I do not aspire, or I don't consider myself to be a person who's wise. I still consider myself a young man. Physically, I don't feel so young, all right? But I still feel like a young man. I don't feel like I've arrived. But I will say that after 14 years here and some of the many things that I've seen here, I have seen out of all of those things, I've seen what prayer is able to do. Prayer is able to make a difference. It really does. And I think that's honestly why I try to preach on that every Wednesday. But anyway, I want to just stop there. We've got about 30 minutes till it's 8 o'clock here. And, you know, if the Holy Spirit moves, you know, we'll know it, right? We'll know it, you know. But let's just pray. Let's talk to him. And I have some prayer requests really quick before